Have you ever imagined being kicked out of your first class seat just because of how you look, even though you rightfully belong there? A 12-year-old girl faced that exact situation on a fateful flight, humiliated and forced down to economy by a head flight attendant, unaware that her father was the airline's president. When the truth came out, the entire first class cabin fell into stunned silence, and the once powerful woman had to bow her head in shame. What happened next? Stay with us for this emotional story, and don't forget to leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Flight 276 of SkyVista Airlines was preparing for takeoff. The first class cabin glowed under soft golden lights. Luxury radiated from every detail: the plush leather seats, the polished tray tables, and the neatly arranged menus. Passengers began settling into their seats. They were well dressed, their subtle perfumes blending into the air. Every gesture exuded elegance and status. A middle-aged man in a gray suit scrolled through charts on his tablet, likely a businessman. Nearby, a woman with voluminous hair and designer sunglasses stirred her expensive coffee with slender fingers, occasionally casting disinterested glances around. Amid this sea of sophistication, a figure stood out. A small girl, about 12 years old, with a light blue dress and a purple backpack hugged tightly to her chest. Her name was Emily. She sat in seat 3B by the window. Her posture was slightly reserved, hands resting nervously on her lap, but her eyes sparkled with excitement. Those wide eyes scanned her surroundings. Everything was so different from what she had imagined. This was her first time flying alone, and even more incredible, she was in first class. This trip was a special reward from her father, Richard Walker, the president of SkyVista Airlines. He had promised her a memorable flight if she excelled in school, and she had delivered. Emily had topped her class in the recent exams. Despite his demanding work schedule, her father had kept his word. When Emily received the first class ticket, she had thrown her arms around her father, her face glowing with joy. To a 12-year-old, it was more than just a flight. It was a symbol of her hard work paying off. But now, as she sat in her seat, she began to notice the fleeting glances, the subtle looks from the other passengers. Some furrowed their brows, others whispered quietly before returning to their tasks. Emily started feeling out of place. She realized she was the youngest person in the cabin. Everyone around her was an adult, impeccably dressed, exuding an air of importance. She looked down at her blue dress, pretty but simple, especially compared to the designer outfits around her. The initial pride she had felt was slowly giving way to anxiety. Do I really belong here? She wondered. But then she remembered her father's words as he handed her the ticket at the airport. You earned this. You deserve to be here. Emily tightened her grip on the ticket, a surge of confidence returning. Yes, she belonged here. This was her reward, her place. Carefully fastening her seatbelt, she turned to gaze out the round airplane window. She watched other planes parked in the distance, luggage carts weaving around, and ground staff waving their signals. It was like a miniature world coming to life before her eyes, a world she had only ever seen on television until now. The speakers crackled as the announcement came through, informing passengers that the plane was preparing for departure. Flight attendants began making their rounds, checking seatbelts, and ensuring everything was in order. Just then, a middle-aged woman in a crisp lead flight attendant uniform stepped into the first-class cabin. Her name was Linda Carter, a senior crew member with over 15 years of experience, known for her strict demeanor and no-nonsense attitude. Mrs. Carter moved swiftly down the aisle, her eyes sweeping over each seat with the practiced precision of someone who demanded perfection. But as her gaze landed on seat 3B, where Emily was sitting, her steps faltered just for a brief moment. Her eyes narrowed. Her expression shifted from professional indifference to subtle surprise, tinged with suspicion. A child? In first class? Alone? How is that possible? The thought flashed through her mind. In all her years serving this exclusive cabin, she had become accustomed to catering to high-profile executives, politicians, and celebrities. Children, when they appeared, were almost always accompanied by wealthy parents or nannies. But this girl, alone, with her little backpack, didn't fit the image Mrs. Carter had come to expect in this elite section. Still, she maintained her professional composure, though her tone carried an undercurrent of doubt. She approached Emily, her voice calm but probing. "Excuse me, sweetie, Is this your seat? Emily looked up, her face polite and innocent. She nodded and held out her ticket. Yes, ma'am. This is 3B. Mrs. Carter took the ticket, but instead of inspecting it thoroughly, she gave it only a cursory glance before handing it back. Her mind had already made its judgment. There must be some kind of mistake. This seat is for first-class passengers only. You know that, right? Her voice grew colder, more authoritative. A few nearby passengers began to take notice. Some glanced over with curiosity, others pretended not to hear. No one intervened. Emily's heart started to race. Her palms became clammy as she gripped her ticket tighter. She knew she was in the right seat, but the doubt in Mrs. Carter's voice made her question herself. The flight attendant stood over her, arms crossed, waiting. The air grew tense, and at that very moment, the flight Emily had once looked forward to with excitement began turning into an experience she would never forget. Emily tightened her grip on the ticket, her palms growing damp with sweat. Mrs. Carter's probing gaze felt like an invisible blade, slicing through the fragile confidence the young girl had built up. In that moment, Emily realized she was being doubted. She was not trusted, despite knowing full well what she had done to earn her place in that seat. Mrs. Carter's voice rang out again. Though still polite, it had a sharpness to it, loud enough for those nearby to hear. Are you absolutely sure this is your seat? This is first class, reserved for passengers who have paid for this exclusive section. Emily swallowed hard. Her voice was soft, but she maintained her manners. Yes, yes, ma'am. My dad booked this seat for me. I'm in 3B. Mrs. Carter's brow furrowed, her skepticism deepening. She extended her hand. Let me see your ticket. With trembling fingers, Emily handed it over. Mrs. Carter glanced at it briefly, far too briefly to truly check. She barely looked before returning it, her judgment already made. In her mind, the conclusion was clear. A child like this, traveling alone, could not possibly belong in first class. Her tone dropped, firmer now. I'm sorry, but there's likely been a mistake. Please gather your things and move to the economy cabin. The words hit Emily like a bolt of lightning. Her heart clenched, not from fear, but from a sense of injustice. She had the ticket. This was her seat. Why was she being sent away? She opened her mouth to protest, but found her throat dry. Her eyes darted around. The other first-class passengers were watching. Some looked curious, others feigned disinterest, but they were all listening. An elderly man with kind eyes shifted in his seat as though he might speak up, but when Mrs. Carter's cold gaze swept over him, he froze. Emily saw it all, the indifference, the silence, the distance. A wave of humiliation welled up in her chest. Still, she fought to stay composed. She would not cry. Her father always told her to be brave. But that didn't mean it didn't hurt. But, this is my seat, Emily whispered, her voice trembling, almost pleading. Mrs. Carter let out a sigh, her patience wearing thin. Sweetheart, I don't want to make this hard for you, but this is first class. Not everyone can sit here. Please, take your things and move to economy. Every word sliced into Emily's dignity. It was not a simple request. It was a declaration that she didn't belong, that no matter what her ticket said, she wasn't worthy of this seat. Because she was just a child, and perhaps, in Mrs. Carter's eyes, because she didn't look like the children of the wealthy who usually occupied first class. Emily took a deep breath. Her hands trembled, but she lowered her head, picked up her small backpack, and slowly stepped out of her seat. She kept her eyes down, avoiding contact with anyone, but her ears caught the faint whispers behind her. A quiet chuckle from a couple, the rustling of a businessman flipping through his newspaper. Every sound seemed to press her deeper into shame. No one spoke up for her. No one said, check her ticket again. They had all seen it, but none of them wanted to get involved. Nearby, the young flight attendant, Sarah, stood still, watching everything unfold. Her hands gripped the tray she was holding, her chest tightening with frustration. She had seen the ticket. It was clearly a first-class seat. But Sarah was new. She knew she couldn't say anything. Mrs. Carter was a veteran, respected, and held power. If Sarah intervened, it could put her job at risk. Emily dragged her feet past the first-class seats, feeling the weight of every stare piercing into her back. When she finally reached the economy section, she slipped into a cramped seat by the window. It was nothing like the plush comfort she had left behind. No soft leather, no warm ambient lights. Just rows of narrow seats, the hum of overlapping conversations, and the occasional cry of a restless child. She curled up by the window, hugging her backpack tightly to her chest. Her eyes welled up, but she bit her lip, determined not to let the tears fall. She pulled out her phone and typed a message to her dad. Dad, they made me move to economy. I had my ticket, but they didn't believe me. Within seconds, her phone vibrated with a reply. Who made you move? What's their name? Emily's eyes darted back toward the first class cabin. She saw Mrs. Carter continuing her duties, her face composed as if nothing had happened. Emily typed quickly, the head flight attendant. Her name is Carter. This time, it took nearly a minute before her dad's response arrived. Flight number? Emily glanced at her ticket and typed it out. After sending the message, she gripped her phone tightly, her heart racing. She didn't know what her dad would do, but she trusted him. Miles away, Richard Walker stared at his phone screen. His jaw tightened, his eyes cold with fury. Without hesitation, he dialed directly to the airline's operations control. This is Richard Walker. I need to speak to the captain of Flight 276. Right now. Those words marked the beginning of a shift that would change everything on that flight. But in first class, Mrs. Carter was blissfully unaware that in just a few short minutes, she would be the one standing under the scrutiny of everyone around her, forced to answer for the bias she had so carelessly acted upon. Emily sat curled up in the cramped seat of the economy cabin, clutching her small backpack tightly against her chest. Her mind was still tangled in a whirlwind of emotions. The excitement and pride she had felt just moments ago had now twisted into confusion, shame, and growing resentment. She knew she had done nothing wrong. The ticket in her hand was proof, clear as day, marked with 3B first class. But the lead flight attendant hadn't even bothered to check it properly. She had dismissed Emily, not because of anything the girl had done, but simply because she was a child, traveling alone, and perhaps because she didn't look like the kind of person who belonged in first class. Emily sighed softly, fighting back the tears that threatened to surface. She didn't want to appear weak in front of strangers, but the sting of being judged, cast aside like she was unworthy, made her chest tighten with pain. She glanced down at her phone, still clenched in her hand. The last message from her father flashed on the screen. Flight number? She had already replied. She trusted that he would do something, though she had no idea what. At that very moment, miles away in the Sky Vista Airlines corporate headquarters, Richard Walker, Emily's father, sat upright in his leather office chair. His face was as cold as steel. He stared at his daughter's message, feeling a slow-burning anger rising within him. It wasn't just because his daughter had been forced out of first class. What infuriated him was the way she had been treated, as if she had no right to be there, as if she wasn't deserving, simply because she didn't fit into someone's narrow perception of what belonged in that cabin. Without hesitation, he picked up his phone and dialed the airline's emergency operations line. Within minutes, the call was patched directly to the cockpit of Flight 276. Captain Harris, a seasoned pilot with over 20 years of experience and a reputation for his calm demeanor, knew immediately that this was no ordinary call when he heard the voice on the other end. This is Richard Walker. My daughter is on your flight. She was seated in first class, 3B. Your lead flight attendant just forced her down to economy without checking her ticket. I want you to verify this and take action, immediately. Captain Harris froze for a brief moment, fully understanding the weight of those words. When the president of the airline personally intervened mid-flight, it was a serious matter. He swiftly picked up the cabin intercom and spoke in a firm, clear voice. Lead flight attendant Linda Carter, please report to the cockpit immediately. In the first-class cabin, Linda Carter flinched slightly upon hearing her name over the speakers. Passengers around her turned their heads, some curious, others pretending not to notice, though the shift in atmosphere was undeniable. Adjusting her uniform, Mrs. Carter took a deep breath and walked briskly toward the cockpit. She had no idea that, in mere minutes, her entire career was about to hang in the balance. The moment she stepped into the cockpit, Mrs. Carter's heart sank. On a small screen in front of the captain was a live video feed from the airline's headquarters. Staring back at her was Richard Walker, the president of Sky Vista Airlines. the man whose decisions could shape the futures of thousands of employees, including her own. His expression was icy, his gaze cutting like a blade. "Are you Linda Carter?" His voice was low and steady, but it carried a weight that made her chest tighten. "Yes, yes, sir. I'm Linda Carter," she replied, her voice trembling for the first time in over 15 years of service. For the first time, she felt like she was standing at the edge of a cliff, about to fall. "Do you realize you just forced my daughter out of her first class seat without even checking her ticket?" The question hit Mrs. Carter like a hammer to the head. She froze for a few seconds, then stammered, I'm sorry, sir. It was a mistake on my part." Mr. Walker cut her off, his tone calm but sharp as ice. "Right now, you will personally go down to economy, bring my daughter back to her first class seat, and when this plane lands, you will explain everything to the executive board. Do you understand me?" Mrs. Carter felt her legs weaken beneath her, but she nodded, her voice trembling. "Yes, yes, sir." The call ended. Captain Harris turned to her with a curt nod. "Go fix it, Linda." Mrs. Carter staggered as she stepped out of the cockpit. As she entered the first-class cabin, the eyes of the passengers were no longer filled with respect for the experienced flight attendant. They knew. She had made a mistake, and now they were watching her wear it like a scarlet letter. Drawing back the curtain into economy, she spotted Emily sitting by the window, her face sad but composed. When their eyes met, Emily flinched slightly, but there was no fear this time, just quiet strength. Mrs. Carter's voice was softer now, stripped of authority, laced with guilt. "Emily, I apologize for the misunderstanding. Please come back to your seat in first class." The entire economy cabin fell silent. Passengers looked up, some confused, others catching on that this was something serious. Emily rose slowly, her eyes locking onto Mrs. Carter's. There was no anger in those young eyes, no smugness, no satisfaction. Just one simple, cutting question. "Why did you think I didn't belong there?" Mrs. Carter opened her mouth, but no words came. In that moment, she knew. There was no excuse that would ever make it right. Her voice cracked. I was wrong." Emily nodded gently, slinging her backpack over her shoulder. She walked past Mrs. Carter, her steps steady, her posture proud. As she returned to her seat in 3B, the first-class passengers lowered their gazes, some embarrassed, some ashamed that they had said nothing. The elderly man from earlier leaned toward her, his voice soft with regret. "I'm sorry. I should have said something." Emily gave him a warm smile, her eyes glistening. "It's okay, sir." As Mrs. Carter stood in the aisle, she felt it. Perhaps for the first time in her long career, the power she once held was gone. She had lost, and she knew the price she would pay would be steep. Flight 276 of SkyVista Airlines continued to glide smoothly through the sky. The engines hummed softly, steady and constant, while beams of sunlight slanted through the first-class windows, casting a gentle golden glow onto seat 3B, where Emily was now sitting once again. She had reclaimed her seat, but the feelings within her were far from the joy and excitement she had felt when she first took her place. Emily tilted her head, gazing out the window. The sky was a brilliant shade of blue, with clouds drifting like cotton below. It was as beautiful as she had imagined before the flight. But now that beauty seemed mixed with the echoes of an experience she would never forget, an experience of being judged, humiliated, but ultimately standing up for her worth and reclaiming her dignity. A few rows away, Mrs. Linda Carter stood by the galley. But the confident, commanding woman who had once walked the aisle with authority was gone. Her face was pale, and her eyes, distant and uneasy, occasionally glanced toward Emily. Shame clung to her like a stain she couldn't shake off. Mrs. Carter knew that in a matter of minutes, when the plane landed, everything would change. She would no longer be the respected figure walking proudly through the cabins. Instead, she would face the airline's executives, explaining herself under their judgmental gaze. She knew the likely outcome. The job she had dedicated over 15 years to was slipping through her fingers. The plane began its descent. The announcement came over the speakers, instructing passengers to fasten their seatbelts and prepare for landing. Conversations softened, movements slowed. But those in first class knew that whatever happened in the air would not simply be forgotten when they touched the ground. Mrs. Carter let out a heavy sigh. For the first time in her career, she felt exposed. stripped not only before her superiors, but also before the very passengers she had once held authority over. She had let her pride and prejudice cloud her judgment. She had believed her experience gave her the right to determine who belonged based on appearance alone, and that arrogance had led her to a mistake, one that could cost her everything. The plane touched down gently. Some passengers sighed with relief, preparing to disembark. Yet in first class, there was still a quiet tension. A few passengers looked toward Emily, some with guilt, others offering faint smiles as if to express their late recognition of her right to be there. Emily nodded politely, though she knew deep down that their looks could not erase what had happened. The doors opened. Passengers filed out in calm succession. As the elderly man who had sat across from Emily passed by her seat, he slowed. He leaned slightly toward her and spoke softly. "You're very brave, and you deserve to be here." Emily looked up, her eyes shimmering, and gave him a gentle smile. His words felt like the validation she had been longing for. Emily looked up, her eyes glistening, and a small, genuine smile broke across her face. The man's words were more than just an apology. They were the acknowledgement she had been longing for. When it was her turn to leave, Emily stood up, slung her backpack over her shoulders, and smoothed out her dress. She began walking toward the exit, but just before stepping out of the first-class cabin, she paused. She turned and looked directly at Mrs. Carter. There was no hatred in her eyes, no triumph, just the gaze of a child, yet within that gaze was a message clear and firm. "You hurt me, but I hope you will change." Mrs. Carter lowered her head, unable to meet Emily's eyes for more than a second. That brief moment made her want to disappear more than anything. But she knew there were some mistakes that could never be erased, and there were some eyes that would haunt her forever. As she stepped off the plane and onto the staircase leading down to the tarmac, Mrs. Carter saw two airline employees waiting. They made eye contact and gave her a slight nod, signaling for her to follow. She knew exactly where they were taking her, to a private room for an internal hearing, or more accurately, an interrogation about her actions on Flight 276. She understood that keeping her job was now little more than a faint hope. But losing her job wasn't the part that frightened her the most. What truly scared her was the realization that she would have to confront the truth, that she had let her own prejudice and assumptions cloud her judgment, and in doing so, she had hurt an innocent 12-year-old girl. A few hours later, sitting in her car alone, Mrs. Carter checked her phone. There was an email from Richard Walker. The message was brief, but it cut deeper than any punishment. "Mistakes can be forgiven, but refusing to change cannot. I hope you understand this." Mrs. Carter set the phone down and stared out at the horizon. The sunset painted the sky a deep red, stretching across the city like a reminder of the day that had changed her life. After 15 years of wearing the uniform, striding confidently through airplane cabins, she realized for the first time it was never the uniform that defined her worth. It was how she treated the people who sat in those seats, no matter who they were. Meanwhile, Emily sat in the passenger seat of her father's car, resting her head against the seat. Her eyes fluttered closed, her heart still processing the whirlwind of emotions from the flight. She felt different, older somehow, as if she had grown up a little more in those few hours. She now understood something her father had always told her. In life, people would sometimes judge her by how she looked. There would be moments when she would be treated unfairly, made to feel like she didn't belong. But what mattered most was knowing who she was, and never letting anyone take that away from her. Richard Walker glanced at his daughter as they waited at a red light. He reached over and gently asked, "You okay?" Emily opened her eyes and smiled softly. "Yeah, I'm okay. I think I learned something really important today." Her father nodded, pride swelling in his chest. His little girl hadn't just earned her place at the top of her class, she had earned respect, and more importantly, she had stood up for herself. The car merged into the flow of evening traffic, the city lights twinkling as night began to fall. Life moved forward. But for everyone who had been on Flight 276 that day, they carried with them a quiet lesson, a reminder that would stay with them long after the flight was over. Respect others, not because of who they are, but because they are human.